Meeting on the crossroads where the two forbidden subjects of religion and politics intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Roundtable. And if you haven't noticed, politics and religion are intersecting in Israel and Gaza. You can't help but talk one without the other. The two go together. So here we are in America observing what we can on the news or through the internet, and we know we have a government that's also involved. Now, I think it'd be good to get a perspective from a libertarian, because not all political parties have the same foreign policy. So I think this would be a very interesting discussion to think of how we as believers associated with a political party deal with the situation we're observing now, where politics and religion are really enmeshed. Garrett, what do you think as a libertarian, as you're observing what's taking place between Israel and Gaza right now and our role as a nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with our foreign policy over the last few decades, especially when it comes to foreign aid, the amount of money that we hand out to various other nations, and we justify it in the name of usually national security, as well as our foreign policy in terms of the use of our military and our military alliances and bases and all that. And I think the bigger issue is the foreign aid. You know, we are giving money to a lot of different countries that don't necessarily have the best American or Christian values in line, and I think it's kind of making us pick sides in this situation. And I honestly, as a Christian, don't think we have enough information to really stand with one side or another. And I know I've seen a lot of Christians, posting, I stand with Israel, and I just want to know from those folks, who are they defining is Israel? Because, whether you're talking about Israel, Palestine, China, Canada, the U.S., any nation is a mixed bag of unregenerate and reprobate sinners, right? Same with their government. To say a blanket statement of I stand with this or that nation, I think is dangerous, because standing in that sense means you're willing to fight with them. And what are they fighting for, and what's their end goal in that?
Yeah. And so as a Christian, you're evaluating it in that regard. Mm-hmm. And how does your libertarian view also inform you regarding the decisions or evaluations you're making in respect to this situation?
Well, the libertarian policy, I think, lines up because we are against foreign aid. In an ideal libertarian government, you wouldn't have government-funded foreign aid. So imagine how much your middle-class taxpayer would save if we decided not to send foreign aid to any country starting next fiscal year. You'd probably get a good chunk of change, back from your federal taxes. But, if someone wants to donate in this age that we have now, with all the technology like PayPal, GoFundMe, and all that, you'd be able to donate that money specifically. And I would say, rather than funneling it through the U.S. government, you find a good Christian mission who's working in the Middle East to bring the gospel, because we're not going to solve Israel and Palestine's conflict by giving them money or giving them weapons. Like, they need the gospel. That's the solution. And our government isn't good at giving the gospel.
Right, exactly. And like you say, I feel like this foreign aid fuels the animosity or fuels the envy
Yep.
And when you've got animosity and envy developing, that's a volatile situation.
Yep.
And I feel like, too, with regard to foreign policy, the old Monroe Doctrine applies to this situation, meaning that Monroe Doctrine told the other hemisphere, stay out of our hemisphere's business.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shouldn't that work both ways?
Yep.
Shouldn't we stay out of the business from the other hemisphere? And that's why I get nervous when arms and money is introduced from a government.
Yep. Yep. And I mean, let's look at the bright side here, is that the gospel is spreading in the Middle East, but in that respect, you have to think that there are Christians on the West Bank, there are Christians in Gaza, there are Christians in Israel, and I bet if you broke down some of those death tolls on either side, a few of those people might unfortunately be Christians. And I think people have it in their mind that this is still, going back to Isaac versus Ishmael. Mm-hmm. And that's not the case anymore. The government of Israel is not representative of the Israel that we read about in the covenant in the Old Testament. It's a big bureaucratic state similar to what we have in the US, and it's run by a bunch of broken sinners. And they're not good at solving problems. And this really comes down to more of an eminent domain issue that's kind of starting these conflicts, because the only established government in the area is Israel. I mean, Gaza and the PLO, and more recently Hamas is kind of a pseudo government. But when it comes to who can take land rights within that area, it's the Israeli government, and that seems to be what fuels a lot of this conflict. Is where is land being claimed and by who?
Yeah, and when we talk about foreign policy, like I say, there are very divergent points of view regarding this. Like if you were a neoconservative, you would say, yes, let's make sure we build up militaries from other countries, especially those who would be our allies. Mm-hmm. Let's stick our nose in their business, and let's try to work our agenda through a nation like Israel.
And how did that work out from like 1975 to 1999?
Yeah, and I feel like let these nations work on their own. Meaning, I feel like, let's be a friend to Israel.
Yep.
And I'm all for it. I'm all for giving them as much emotional support as possible. Mm-hmm. And in saying that, I feel like it's consistent with what I think John Quincy Adams said. We're a champion of our own liberty. We're a friend to the liberty of other people.
Absolutely.
And that, to me, I think is a principle to operate under when you're dealing with this issue that we see erupting in Israel and Gaza now. And the more we can stay out of things militarily, the better off we'll be. And I feel like, won't they be better off as well?
Yeah, and I think it'll make it easier for us to go there and be involved, like humanitarian and missionary wise. If we're not seen as the military strong arm that's coming in there, maybe that'll open some doors to come over there, with the gospel and break down those barriers. Like I was reading in chapter 10 of Acts with Peter's encounter with Cornelius, like those barriers got broken down there between the Jews and the whole rest of the world. When Peter's talking about Gentiles, I mean, he's kind of, Cornelius was probably like Southern Italian or whatever, but it seems like more broadly speaking, not just Greeks, but the whole non-Jewish world. So, I mean, instead of saying I stand with Israel, maybe the better statement is that I stand with the poor in spirit. I stand with those who mourn. I stand with the meek. I stand with those who hunger for righteousness. I stand with the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and the persecuted for righteous sake. I stand with Christ.
Yeah, wow. That's something to really consider, because here's my struggle, and I appreciate the perspective I've heard, and I tend to agree with it. This old covenant was a covenant that established the land for Israel. And that covenant is everlasting. Mm-hmm. I find myself struggling with that in the sense, here we have a government in Israel that's not the theocratic one that was in ancient Israel. That distinction needs to be made. How fast are those land promises still today?
Yeah, I mean, then we get into the sovereignty of God in that sense, right? Like, do we really have that low view of God to think that we need to keep that covenant between God and Israel, that we need to intervene and like make that so? You don't think if that's God's holy will that he's going to make it happen?
Yeah, and that's why I'm very reluctant for this kind of intervention that we've been doing. It's not healthy. It's not good.
Right.
Leave it in God's sovereign hands,
Yep.
and he'll take care of it.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you are joining here for this discussion on Israel, Gaza, and how the two, politics and religion, intersect. Join us next time on the Sophie Scholl Roundtable.